I had been in the studio since just after sunrise, working on a commission that was already overdue. The studio wasn't mine, it was a small countryside space I had rented in Otepi for a month, mostly because I thought the isolation would help me focus. It was an old building, half converted from what I think used to be a farmhouse, with a single heavy wooden door as the entrance. The landlord had told me to keep it locked while I worked, because no one else used the property and it sat far from the main road. I'd nodded at the time, but didn't take his warning too seriously. That morning, I'd let myself in, locked the door from the inside, and tossed the bolt. It wasn't an unusual thing to do, it was just habit now. Then, I set up my easel, put on my headphones, and got to work. Hours slipped by in that strange way they do when your painting time felt like. It wasn't moving at all. And then suddenly, it had been 6 hours without me eating or even stepping away for a break. It was the ache in my back that made me stop. I set down my brush, stretched, and pulled my headphones down around my neck. That's when I noticed that the bolt on the door was pushed all the way across, tight against the frame. That in itself wasn't strange. I'd locked it, after all. But my mind registered something else in that moment. The sound of it sliding into place was fresh in my head. The same dull clunk I'd heard this morning when I'd locked it was now echoing in my memory again. But I hadn't touched it since. It was a ridiculous thing to think, I know, but it felt like I had heard it just seconds ago. Even though I'd been lost in my painting, I walked over to the door, half smiling at myself for being paranoid, and touched the bolt. It was warm, not hot exactly, but not cold like the rest of the metal fixtures in the room. I tested it. Sliding it back and forth, it moved smoothly. Nothing wrong with it. I let it stay locked and turned away, telling myself my brain was playing tricks. About 10 minutes later, I decided I needed tea. There was a small kitchenette in the corner, so I boiled water, poured it over a tea bag, and sat back down in front of my canvas. But I couldn't focus the same way as before. I kept glancing toward the door, like I expected it to open or make a noise again. I don't know why I suddenly felt like I needed to check outside. I stood, slid the bolt back, and pulled on the door handle. It didn't budge. At first I thought it was just stuck old wood swelling or something. I pulled harder. The door didn't move at all, not even a rattle in the frame. I slid the bolt open and closed a few times just to be sure I wasn't doing something stupid. But it was definitely unlocked now. Still, it wouldn't move. It was. Then I noticed a thin sliver of light coming through the gap where the door met the frame. That gap should have widened when I pulled on the handle, but it stayed exactly the same. Something on the other side was pressing it shut. The landlord had told me the only way in or out of this building was through that door. The windows were too small and too high to climb through. They were more like vents than actual windows. I knocked, calling out in case someone had come by and accidentally blocked the door with something. No answer. I pressed my ear against the wood, listening. At first, nothing, just silence. Then, so faint I almost thought I imagined it, there was the slow scrape of something metallic, like someone dragging the tip of a key or a nail across the outside of the door. I stepped back quickly, heart thudding. My rational brain was already working. Maybe the landlord had stopped by. Maybe he was fixing something. Maybe he'd locked it from the outside without realizing I was in here. But that made no sense. The bolt was on my side. If it was locked, I was the one who had done it. I called the landlord's number, straight to voicemail. I tried again. Same thing. The reception in that building was awful, but normally I could still get a call through after a few tries. This time it just wouldn't connect. I went back to the door and gave it my full weight, ramming my shoulder into it. It didn't shift. My breathing was faster now. I reminded myself I had food, water, even a small bed in the corner. I wasn't trapped without supplies, but something about being stuck in there, with no way out, started pressing in on me immediately. I went back to my painting, telling myself to just work until I heard from the landlord. But the moment I sat down, there it was again, the metallic scrape, louder this time, not constant, but slow, deliberate drags, like someone drawing lines on the door in long, uneven strokes. I stood so fast the chair tipped over. I shouted through the door, asking who was there. The sound stopped instantly. I listened for footsteps, for movement, for anything. There was nothing. My own voice had sounded too loud in the small room. I thought about trying to pry open one of the small windows. Even though they were barely wider than my forearm, I dragged over a stool, climbed up, and pushed at the nearest one. It didn't open. It was nailed shut, the old kind of nail with a flattened head. I checked the others, same thing. By now, the unease had shifted into something sharper. I wasn't just trapped. Someone had made sure I was trapped. I went back to the door and decided to really look at it. The bolt was fine. The frame looked fine. Then I noticed a small shadow in the gap where the light was coming through. Something thin and straight was wedged there, just above the handle. I crouched, squinting. It looked like the edge of a long, flat tool, maybe a crowbar. That made no sense at all unless someone had jammed it there to keep the door shut. My pulse was hammering so hard I could hear it. I grabbed a palette knife from my table and tried to wedge it into the gap from my side, but the tool on the other side was wedged deep. It didn't move for the next half hour. I alternated between trying to force the door and standing absolutely still, listening for more sounds. The scraping didn't come back. It was worse, somehow, that whoever had been out there wasn't making noise anymore. Then I smelled smoke. It was faint, but distinct, dry, woody, like something burning slowly. Panic snapped through me. If the building caught fire, there was no way out. I ran to the kitchenette, unplugged the kettle, checked the stove. Everything was off. The smell wasn't coming from inside. I put my face near the floor by the door, where the gap was widest. The smoke smell was stronger there. Someone was burning something just outside. My first thought was that they were trying to scare me. My second thought was that they might be trying to smoke me out. I grabbed a glass of water and poured it over the gap under the door. Not that it would help much. My hands were shaking so badly that half the water missed and ran down the inside of the door. I shouted again, demanding to know who was there, but my voice cracked halfway through. No reply. The smoke smell didn't get much stronger, and after about 10 minutes, it faded entirely. That almost scared me more, like they'd given up on that idea and were planning something else. It was nearly dark when my phone finally rang. The landlord's number. I answered instantly, my voice tumbling over itself as I explained that the door was jammed. Someone was outside. I couldn't get out. He listened quietly, then said, "That's not possible. The bolt is on your side." "I know it's on my side," I said, trying not to scream. "Something's wedged in the gap like a crowbar or something." He paused for so long I thought the line had dropped. Then he said, "Stay away from the door. I'm 20 minutes away." Those 20 minutes were the longest of my life. I sat in the farthest corner, knees drawn up, eyes fixed on the door. Every small sound in the building, the tick of the cooling kettle, the shift of the wooden beams made me flinch. When I finally heard the crunch of tires outside, I almost cried. The landlord called my name from outside. I ran to the door, yelling back. There was a short metallic clang, and then the door swung inward easily. I stumbled out into the fading light. The landlord was standing there, holding a long, rusted metal wedge. "This was jammed in," he said. I looked round. The yard was empty, the dirt road stretching away in both directions. "Did you see anyone?" I asked. He shook his head. "No one." I told him about the scraping, the smoke. His expression tightened, but he didn't say anything for a while. Finally, he said, "This building used to belong to a man who, let's just say, he didn't like people leaving once they'd come inside. The door hasn't been forced from the outside in decades. I don't know how anyone got that wedge in without you hearing." I didn't sleep there again. I packed my things that night and left before sunrise. I never found out who had been outside that door or why. But sometimes, even now, when I'm painting alone, I swear I can hear that slow, deliberate scrape of metal just beyond the walls. Story number 2. When I first moved to Invercargill in 1988, I was 21, in my second year of university, and desperate to get out of the noisy, cramped flat I'd been sharing with 3 other students. I found the boarding house through a notice pinned up in the library. Quiet, furnished room for rent, mature students preferred. The price was reasonable, the location perfect, and the landlady, Mrs. Keegan, seemed polite in a brisk, no-nonsense way. I didn't think much of the large, heavy mirror hanging above the writing desk when I first saw the room. She said it came with the furniture and couldn't be moved because it was fixed solid. I agreed without caring. I needed a bed, a desk, and some quiet. The first night passed without incident. The second night, I was up late reading for a history paper when I glanced at the mirror and saw something odd, not a trick of the light, but a flicker, as if the reflection had shifted by a fraction of a second. I thought maybe it was my tired eyes. I leaned closer and, just for a moment, the reflection wasn't of me at all. It showed a woman, her hair piled high, wearing what looked like an old-fashioned white wedding gown. The vision was gone before I could even gasp. I told myself it was just fatigue, but the memory of her stayed with me. Over the next week, the flashes came more often. I'd be brushing my hair, and in the mirror I'd see not my own dark fringe, but the same woman in white, standing perfectly still, her face always turned slightly away. Sometimes the scene seemed wider, as though I were looking into a whole other room. I could make out tall candles, flowers, and a man in a dark suit. It was never clear for more than a second, but my heart would pound every time. I didn't tell anyone. Back then, being a transgender woman at uni was enough to make you feel exposed without adding "C's strange" visions to the list. One Friday night, I was sitting at my desk, writing an essay, when the vision came without warning. It was sharper than ever. A small church hall, rows of people, and the woman in the gown walking slowly down an aisle. I couldn't hear anything, but I could see her smile faintly at the man waiting ahead. Then something shifted. The man's expression changed, and from somewhere to the left, a figure moved quickly into view. His arm swung, and I saw the glint of metal before the woman's head jerked back violently. The image shattered, like a film reel tearing, and I was staring at my own pale face again. I sat there for a long time, shaking. That night I barely slept. By morning, I was convinced I needed to know if what I'd seen was my imagination or something more. I went to the university library and spent hours combing through old newspaper archives. On microfilm, it was pure chance that I found it. The Southland Times, November 1881. Brutal murder at wedding celebration. Young bride fatally stabbed. The grainy column described how 22-year-old Margaret C., newly married, had been attacked during the reception in a church hall. The killer had escaped in the chaos and was never caught. The bride had worn a white satin gown with lace trimming, and her death had shocked the entire town. I read the piece 3 times. It wasn't just similar to what I'd seen. It was exactly the same. When I returned to the boarding house, I looked at the mirror differently. I couldn't shake the idea that it had somehow witnessed that murder or held onto it. I thought about asking Mrs. Keegan if she knew where it came from, but I worried she'd think I was unhinged. Instead, I tried to ignore it, covering it with a towel at night, but the visions didn't stop. If anything, they got stronger. Now I'd see fragments when I wasn't even looking. A hand gripping a knife reflected in the glass of my teacup, a flicker of the bride's face in the dark of the hallway. My stomach was in knots all the time. One Sunday, after another sleepless night, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I waited until Mrs. Keegan went to church, then dragged a chair over and tried to lift the mirror off the wall. It didn't budge. The screws were huge and sunk deep into the wood. In frustration, I pried at one with the tip of a butter knife until it slipped and cut my palm. I swore under my breath and pressed a tissue to the blood. That's when I noticed something. The vision had started again, only this time I wasn't seeing the wedding. I was seeing myself, standing where I was in my room, but behind me, in the reflection, the bride was there. She was closer than she'd ever been. Her head tilted down toward my bleeding hand. Her mouth moved, but no sound came out. I spun around, and of course, there was nothing. When I looked back, the mirror was just a mirror again. I felt dizzy and sick. That was the first time I felt truly afraid, not just unsettled. Over the next few days, I became obsessed with the murder. I went back to the archives, pulling every article I could find. The reception had been held in a hall that was torn down decades later, but I found a reference to some of the furnishings, including a large gilt-framed mirror being sold at auction in 1890. There was no photograph, but my gut told me it was the same mirror. I couldn't prove it, but I didn't need to. I knew. I told myself I'd move out, but the semester was half over and money was tight. I thought I could last until the term ended. Then one night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps in my room. My eyes flew open and I saw a figure standing at the desk, looking into the mirror. It was a man, tall and lean, in an old-fashioned suit. His reflection was clearer than his actual outline. Like the glass was giving him shape, I froze, my whole body tense. He turned his head slowly toward me, and though I couldn't see his face clearly, I felt a wave of cold fury rolling off him. He lifted his arm, and for a heartbeat, I thought I saw the knife. I must have blacked out, because the next thing I knew, it was morning, and the room was empty. But the towel I'd kept over the mirror was on the floor. My right hand, the one that had been cut, ached in a deep, bone-deep way. That was the day I packed my bags. When I told Mrs. Keegan I was leaving, she didn't ask why. She just nodded, and as I was wheeling my suitcase out, she said quietly, "That mirror's been here longer than I have. I don't like to sit at that desk myself." It was the only acknowledgement she ever gave me. I moved into a much smaller room closer to campus, and for weeks afterward, I'd wake up expecting to see that gold frame in the corner. I told a few friends about what happened, but most laughed, or gave me that polite, tight smile people use when they think you've been imagining things. I stopped talking about it. Years later, when I was in my 30s, I came back to Invercargill for a work trip and walked past the old boarding house. It was boarded up, the windows dusty. I wondered if the mirror was still in there, fixed to the wall in that empty room, holding the last moments of a young bride's life like an insect trapped in amber. I thought about going in, but I didn't. Some things I've learned are better left unseen. Story number 3. I moved into the house in Aberdare in the summer of 1994. It was just me and my son, Daniel, who had just turned 6. I was still reeling from the divorce, so I wanted somewhere quiet and affordable, far from the city, where I could give him a fresh start. The rent was low enough to make me suspicious, but the place was clean, spacious, and only a short walk from the school. The landlord, an older man named Mr. Hughes, said it had been empty for a while, but didn't go into detail. I didn't ask. For the first 2 weeks, everything was normal. I'd tuck Daniel into bed at 8, then sit downstairs with a cup of tea and the television on low. The house had that old miner's terrace layout, narrow hallway, small front room, stairs, leading right up from the front door. I wasn't used to the creaks and pops of an older house, but I learned to ignore them. Then one night, after Daniel had been asleep for an hour, I heard it. Heavy, deliberate footsteps in the hallway above me. Not the light pitter-patter of my son's bare feet. These were slow, firm, and weighted. Boots. I froze with my teacup halfway to my mouth, my eyes locked on the ceiling. The steps moved from one end of the hallway to the other, pausing briefly, then turning back. "Daniel," I called up. The footsteps stopped dead. I set my cup down, my heartbeat pounding in my ears, and climbed the stairs. Daniel's door was closed when I opened it. He was curled under his blanket, breathing evenly, as far as I could tell. He hadn't moved. I checked the rest of the upstairs, but there was no one. I told myself it must have been the floorboards settling, though deep down I knew the sound I'd heard wasn't that. The following night, it happened again. This time I was sitting on the couch with the TV off, half reading a magazine. The boots began at the top of the stairs, walked past Daniel's room, and stopped directly above where I sat. Then, after a pause, they turned and walked back the other way. I didn't go upstairs this time. I sat rigid, listening until the sound stopped. By the 4th night, it had become a pattern. Always after Daniel was asleep. Always the same slow pacing. I started to dread the evenings. I told myself I was being silly. That old houses made noises, but this was too regular, too distinct. One Saturday afternoon, I mentioned it casually to a neighbor, Mrs. Evans, while we were chatting in her garden. Her face stiffened in a way that told me she knew something, but wasn't sure if she should say it. "You're in the old Williams place, aren't you?" she asked. I nodded. She hesitated. "My husband worked the pits before they shut." "You're House sits right above one of the old shafts. They filled it in years ago. But there was an accident there. Foreman named Gareth Morgan, good man, got trapped when part of the tunnel collapsed. They didn't recover his body until days later. I didn't know what to say, so I just listened. They say he was still wearing his boots when they brought him up. Big, heavy things. I think they've got them in the mining museum now. That night, the footsteps sounded louder, more deliberate. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, every muscle tense. I tried to convince myself that Mrs. Evans' story was just a coincidence, but I couldn't ignore the image of those boots. Over the next week, I started noticing something new. The footsteps no longer stayed in the hallway. Sometimes they would stop outside my bedroom door. I'd lie there holding my breath, waiting, listening to the faint scrape of leather shifting against the wooden floorboards. Then, after what felt like minutes, they'd move away. One night, I snapped. I was too tired, too stressed, and too angry to be scared anymore. When the boots stopped outside my door, I threw it open. The hallway was empty. The floorboards under me were cold. Daniel's door was shut, and when I checked, he was fast asleep. After that, I started sleeping with my bedroom door locked, but locking the door didn't stop the sound. If anything, it made it worse. The boots would come right up to the door and pause there for so long that I'd start to imagine the person, no, the thing, on the other side. I'd picture a tall man in dusty overalls, his face hidden in shadow, just standing there listening. One night in early October, I was woken by Daniel's voice calling from downstairs. He was crying, asking me to come. My stomach dropped. I'd put him to bed hours ago. I unlocked my door and ran down the stairs. He was standing in the front room in his pajamas, pale and shaking. "Ma'am," he whispered, "there's a man in the hallway." I pulled him into my arms and looked toward the hall. Empty. "What did you see?" I asked. He had boots on. Big boots. He walked past my door. He didn't look at me. I didn't sleep at all that night. The following day, I called Mr. Hughes and told him I was thinking of leaving. He sounded unsurprised, but said nothing to try to keep me. "Do what's best for you and your boy," he said. I gave notice, but we still had 3 weeks to stay before I could move. And in those 3 weeks, things escalated. The boots started earlier each night, sometimes before Daniel was even asleep. They were louder now, almost like they were stamping. Once, I heard them run the length of the hallway, fast, before stopping abruptly. I was so frightened I thought my heart might give out. Then came the night I'll never forget. It was a Thursday. I'd put Daniel to bed and was sitting in the kitchen, trying to drown out the tension with the hum of the fridge. The boots started upstairs. I ignored them, focusing on the magazine in front of me. But then they moved down the stairs. I could hear the weight of each step, slow and deliberate, until they reached the bottom. I stared at the kitchen doorway, waiting for something to appear. Nothing did. But the steps started again, crossing the hallway toward me. I wanted to run, but I couldn't move. My body felt pinned in place by some invisible force. The boots stopped just outside the kitchen door. There was a pause. Then, slowly, one boot scraped against the linoleum as if testing the floor. That broke me. I grabbed the nearest thing, a chair, and shouted, "Get out!" My voice was shaking. The sound stopped instantly. I don't remember going upstairs, but somehow I ended up in bed with Daniel, holding him until morning. The next day, I went to the mining museum in town. I told myself it was just curiosity, but deep down, I needed to see for myself. There, in a glass case, were the boots. They were massive, the leather worn and scuffed, the soles thick with old dried earth, the plaque read, "Work boots of Gareth Morgan, Foreman, Aberdare Colliery," worn at the time of the 1928 shaft collapse. My legs went weak. I couldn't look at them for long. When I got home, I told Daniel we were staying at my sister's until the move. We packed a few bags and left that evening. The night we left, I locked the door behind me and stood for a moment on the front step. The house was dark and silent. As I turned to go, I thought I heard a faint creak from upstairs, the sound of a single step. I didn't look back. We moved into a small flat across town and never returned to the old house. I heard from Mrs. Evans later that it sat empty for a year before someone else moved in. She didn't know how long they lasted. I've tried to rationalize it over the years, to tell myself it was stress or an overactive imagination or some strange acoustic quirk of the building. But the truth is, I know what I heard. I know what Daniel saw, and sometimes, late at night when the flat is quiet, I think I can still hear the faint, steady tread of boots pacing above me. Story number 4. I was living back in Oban in 1982, looking after my father after my mother passed away. He was 78 then, slower on his feet but still sharp in his mind, at least. I thought he was. I'd visit every day after work, bring his groceries, make sure he'd eaten, help him with the post. He'd sit in the same chair he'd had since I was a boy, pipe unlit now for years, looking out at the harbor as if he was expecting something. That summer, I noticed him talking more and more under his breath. At first I assumed he was speaking to himself, the way lonely people do. But one afternoon, as I was putting away some bread in the kitchen, I heard him laugh, not his usual laugh, but something brighter, lighter, almost boyish. I went back into the living room and asked him what was funny. Just something Archie said. He told me, smiling. I froze a little at the name. Archie McLean. That was his best friend when they were boys. Archie had drowned in 1922, when they were only 18. His fishing boat never made it back from a trip. My father rarely talked about it, except in brief, sad mentions. I said carefully, "You mean you were remembering something?" he said. "No," he replied, still smiling faintly. He was just telling me I shouldn't worry about the herring prices. I felt my stomach knot. "Dad, Archie's been gone 60 years. He frowned, but not in confusion, more in irritation at me. "I know that. I'm not daft. But he was here just now, sitting right there," he said, pointing at the armchair opposite his. I didn't press him that day. I told myself it was just loneliness twisting his memories, or maybe the early signs of something worse. But over the next few weeks, it became impossible to ignore. He began referring to things Archie had told him, little pieces of advice, private jokes, even fishing stories. He'd never told them before, but he spoke like they were shared in real time. One evening, I came in to find him speaking in a voice that wasn't his. It was lighter, quicker, with a faint coastal lilt I'd never heard from him. I stood there listening as he said, The swell came up fast, faster than we thought. You could smell the rain before you saw it. Then the bow went under, and..." He stopped suddenly and stared at me, as if realizing I'd been there the whole time. I asked him, quietly, "Was that Archie?" He nodded once. "He's been telling me what happened that night." That night had always been a mystery. They'd found bits of Archie's boat days later, but no one knew exactly how it went down. I didn't know what to say, but I wrote everything down later. It went on for months. My father's voice would change without warning, sometimes mid-sentence. He'd talk about things Archie saw as the boat went down, the water rushing in, the other lad on board screaming, the cold pulling him under. The detail was unsettling. He described things that didn't sound like my father's imagination at all. In November, while cleaning out a drawer in his bedroom, I found an old showbox tied with twine. Inside were letters, dozens of them. The paper was brittle, the ink faded, but I could still read them. They were all addressed to my father, but none of them had ever been opened. I checked the postmarks. They were all from late 1922 and early 1923, after Archie's death. My father must never have seen them. Maybe his mother hid them, thinking they'd upset him. I sat down and read them in order. They were from Archie's cousin, who had been living up the coast in Ullapool. He'd written after hearing rumors about what happened. In one of the first letters, he said a fisherman who'd been out that same night claimed to have seen Archie's boat struggling in the swell, the lantern flickering. In the next letter, he described how the survivor, the other lad on the boat, whose name I didn't recognize, had made it ashore days later, delirious and frostbitten. Before he died of pneumonia, he told someone the exact way the boat had gone under. And it was exactly, word for word, what my father had been repeating in Archie's voice. I sat there with those letters in my lap for a long time, my hands trembling. It wasn't possible. My father hadn't read them. I'd never heard that survivor's account. But my father, in that strange voice, had been telling me the same story for weeks. That night I took the letters to his chair and handed them to him. "These were sent to you 60 years ago," I said. He untied the twine slowly, with fingers that shook. He read through the first one, then the second. By the third, his face was pale. When he reached the last, he set it down and said quietly, "This is what he told me, every word. He's been telling me he didn't want to be forgotten, said no one ever knew the truth." I asked him if he believed Archie was really speaking to him. He looked at me with a strange calm. "I don't need to believe. I've been hearing him every day." Over the next week, Archie's visits became more frequent. My father would spend whole hours talking in that other voice, describing things from their boyhood, fishing from the pier, stealing apples, small pranks they'd pulled. But then, without warning, the stories would turn back to that night. The cold, the panic, the weight dragging him down. It began to feel like he was reliving it, over and over. I was frightened, not just because it was impossible, but because my father was changing. He began to call me Jamie, which was what Archie had called him as a boy, not the other way round. Sometimes when I came into the room, he'd look at me blankly, as if expecting someone else. One evening in December, I arrived to find him sitting at the table with a small, neat pile of his belongings in front of him. His watch, his old penknife, a photograph of him and Archie from 1921. "I'm going out on the water tomorrow," he said. "Archie says it's time." I tried to keep my voice steady. "You can't, Dad. You're not well enough." He gave me that same irritated look as before. "I'm not going to fish." Just to see him off properly, I stayed over that night, to make sure he didn't try anything. He didn't sleep. He just sat in his chair, murmuring to someone I couldn't hear. At dawn, he stood up and said, "All right, Archie, I'm ready." I blocked the door. "No, Dad, you're not leaving." He stared at me for a long moment, then smiled faintly. "All right, Jamie, maybe you're right." He sat back down. 3 days later, he died in his sleep, peacefully, the doctor said. After the funeral, I took the letters back to my flat. I thought about burning them, but couldn't bring myself to do it. They sat in my wardrobe for months. Then one night, I woke to a voice in my room. It wasn't my father's. It was lighter, quicker, with that faint coastal lilt I'd never heard from anyone else in my life, except through my father. It said, "Jamie, I'm glad you listened." I lay there frozen, staring into the dark, and then, as quickly as it came, it was gone. I haven't heard it since, but I've never opened the wardrobe at night again. Story number 5. When I was 17, my father left me alone in our house in Perpignan for the first time. He had to drive to Marseille for a late-night delivery for his work, and he wouldn't be back until early morning. It wasn't a big deal. We'd lived in that house my whole life, and I was used to being alone during the day. But this was the first night I'd have the entire place to myself, and I was both excited and a little uneasy. The house was an old 2-story building my grandfather had left us. My bedroom was upstairs, and the window overlooked the narrow street. In front, you couldn't get to it from the outside without a long ladder. There was no balcony, no tree close enough to climb, just bare wall beneath it. The only reason I even noticed that fact in the first place was because my father used to joke, "You're safe from burglars unless they bring climbing gear." He left around 8 in the evening. I waved him off, then locked the door and went upstairs. I spent a while watching videos, messaging friends, and generally killing time. At some point, I realized it was past midnight and I was feeling tired. I decided to brush my teeth before heading to bed. It was while I was in the bathroom, electric toothbrush buzzing in my mouth, that I heard it. A sound that didn't belong, slow, spaced out, and deliberate. 3 knocks, not on the door, not on the walls, on my window. At first, I froze with my toothbrush halfway out of my mouth, trying to decide if I'd just imagined it. I wasn't sure why, but I immediately knew it wasn't the kind of random noise houses make when they settle. This had rhythm. Someone had done it on purpose. I spat the toothpaste out, rinsed quickly, and stood there listening. My heart was already racing. I tried to tell myself it must have been a bird or some loose branch, but there were no branches near that side of the house. I knew that as surely as I knew my own name. Then it came again. 3 knocks, slow, measured, each one perfectly distinct. I didn't want to look. I know that sounds ridiculous, but I felt like if I stayed where I was, maybe whatever it was, wouldn't see me. But the bathroom was across from my bedroom, and the only way to check the window was to step inside. I swallowed and forced myself to move. I walked into my room, trying to be as quiet as possible. I stopped just short of the window and listened again. Nothing. No movement outside. No cars. No voices. The curtains were half drawn, and there was a gap just wide enough to peek through. Without fully revealing myself, I leaned slightly to the side and looked. There was nothing there. The street below was empty. The pale light from the street lamp lit up the front wall of our house, and I could see it clearly. No ladder, no shadow, no figure, just emptiness. I told myself it must have been some strange coincidence, maybe a bird after all, or the sound traveling from somewhere else. I closed the curtains fully and sat on my bed, phone in hand. I was just about to message my friend about it when the knocking came again. This time it was louder, same rhythm, 3 knocks. I dropped the phone. My first thought was to call my dad, but then I realized if I told him what was happening, he'd just panic on the road and tell me to call the police. And if I called the police, they'd find nothing and I'd feel like an idiot. I picked up the phone anyway and opened the camera. I don't know why, maybe to catch whoever it was in the act, or maybe just to prove to myself I wasn't losing my mind. I switched to video and pointed it toward the window. Nothing happened for about a minute. I could hear my breathing in the recording. Then, knock, knock, knock. The sound was so close it made my chest tighten. I felt like the air had thickened in the room. I didn't open the curtains this time. I just sat there, staring at the fabric, waiting for something else. But after that, there was silence again. I stopped recording and played it back. The knocking was clear as day in the audio. That made me feel both relieved and terrified. It wasn't in my head. I decided to go downstairs. I told myself it was because I'd feel safer in the living room, but really, it was because I didn't want to be anywhere near that window. I grabbed my blanket and phone and made my way down. Turning on every light I passed, I sat on the couch and tried to distract myself with TV. I kept the volume low so I could hear if anything else happened. For maybe 20 minutes, it seemed like things had gone back to normal. Then I heard footsteps upstairs. I froze again, straining to listen. The sound was faint, but steady, soft creaks of weight shifting on floorboards. My father's old warning ran through my head. If you ever hear something upstairs when you're alone, get out of the house. I wanted to believe I was imagining it, but the steps moved. They went from one side of the upstairs to the other, slow, as if whoever it was didn't care about being heard. I grabbed the house phone, the one on the side table, and dialed my dad. He picked up on the second ring, his voice heavy with concern. I told him exactly what was happening, my voice shaking. Get out of the house now. He said immediately, go to the neighbors and wait there. I'm calling the police. I didn't argue. I slipped on my shoes, grabbed my keys, and headed for the door. But as I reached for the handle, the knocking came again, from the window above me this time. Not my bedroom window, the smaller one in the stairwell landing. 3 knocks. I bolted out the front door without even locking it and ran to the neighbor's house. I banged on their door until they answered, and when they saw my face, they didn't even ask questions. They pulled me inside. Within 10 minutes, 2 police cars pulled up outside my house. I watched from the neighbor's window as they went in with flashlights. They were inside for maybe 15 minutes before coming back out. One of them came over to speak to me. They hadn't found anyone inside. No signs of forced entry. Nothing disturbed. The officer said it was probably someone playing a prank, maybe using a stick to knock on the windows from below. I told him that was impossible for the second-story window, but he just shrugged and said people find ways. My dad got home around 4 a.m. He went upstairs with me to show me everything was fine. I didn't sleep that night, but nothing else happened. The next day, I was determined to figure out how it could have happened. I checked the outside wall beneath my window. No ladder marks, no scuffs. The ground there was undisturbed. I even tried knocking on the window from outside myself using a long broom, but the angle was wrong. It barely reached, and the sound was completely different from what I'd heard. A week later, I was alone again for a few hours in the evening. My dad had gone to a friend's, and I was in the kitchen making a sandwich when the phone rang. It was the house phone, not my mobile. I answered, expecting it to be my dad, but there was no voice, just the faint sound of knocking. 3 knocks. I hung up immediately. The call had come from our own number. That was the moment I realized it wasn't a prank. Whoever, whatever, had been knocking wasn't outside. It had been inside the house the whole time. I never stayed there alone again. My dad thought I was overreacting, but I couldn't explain the way my stomach turned when I remembered. Those knocks, that rhythm had burned itself into my memory. 2 months later, my dad put the house up for sale. He never told me exactly why, but I think he knew more than he let on. When we were packing, I noticed something I hadn't before. Faint marks on the inside of my bedroom window frame. 3 short scratches, evenly spaced, like something had tapped there over and over. We moved to an apartment across town. I haven't heard the knocking since, but sometimes when I'm lying in bed late at night, I still find myself holding my breath, waiting for it. Story number 6. It happened when I was 12, and I've never told anyone the full version until now. My parents had gone to visit my aunt in Rimouski for the weekend, and I had begged them to let me stay home. I was old enough, I told them. I could make my own dinner, lock up the house, and go to bed on time. I promised. They hesitated, but eventually agreed, mostly because a heavy snowstorm had already begun, and they didn't want to risk more driving than necessary. They left in the late morning, and I had the house to myself for the first time in my life. It wasn't a big deal at first. I watched TV, played a few games on the old computer, made myself a peanut butter sandwich. By early evening, the wind had picked up and the house was creaking in that way it does during winter storms. I didn't mind. I'd grown up with that sound. I turned on every light in the main floor, not because I was scared, but because it made the place feel more alive. I even called my best friend Mark, but the phone lines were already crackling, so we didn't talk long. It was maybe an hour after dark when I first heard it. A dull, heavy thud from somewhere in the kitchen. At first, I thought something had fallen from the counter. I walked in, expecting to see a pot on the floor or maybe a bag of bread tipped over. Everything looked normal. I shrugged it off and went back to the living room. 5 minutes later, another thud, this one sharper, almost like someone had hit a hollow surface with their fist. It came from the same direction, the kitchen. I felt a little knot form in my stomach, but I told myself it was just the storm rattling something loose. I went back again, checking the back door, the windows, the shelves, nothing out of place. I stood there for a moment listening. Nothing. I returned to the couch, but I didn't sit. I was about to pick up the remote when it happened a third time. This time, it wasn't just a thud. It was followed by a faint scraping sound, slow and irregular, like nails dragging against wood. I froze. It was coming from the pantry. Our pantry wasn't a big walk-in one, just a tall cupboard built into the corner, big enough to hold cans, boxes, and some cleaning supplies on the bottom shelves. The door had a small brass knob and an old-fashioned key lock, though we almost never locked it. My parents kept the key hanging on a hook inside the cupboard above the stove. I knew for a fact it was locked now because I'd tried opening it earlier in the day, looking for cookies, and found it wouldn't budge. The sound came again, a hollow bang from inside. My mouth went dry. I didn't move for a full 30 seconds, just staring at the door, half expecting it to rattle. Then I told myself I was being ridiculous. Maybe a bag of flour had fallen over, or a jar had rolled from one shelf to another. I grabbed the chair from the table, climbed up, and reached for the key above the stove. My hands were shaking more than I wanted to admit. I climbed down and stood in front of the pantry. I listened again. Silence. My heart was hammering, but I slipped the key into the lock and turned it. The click sounded way too loud. I pulled the door open. Everything on the shelves was exactly where it should be. Flour bag upright, jars lined in a neat row, cereal boxes stacked. No mess, no fallen items. I let out a shaky laugh, annoyed at myself. I closed the door, locked it again out of habit, and put the key back. For a while, I didn't hear anything else. It was maybe an hour later when the banging came again, louder, faster, like something was slamming against the inside of the door. I leapt off the couch, my heart in my throat. This time I didn't move closer. I just stood there, listening, every hair on my body standing up. The sound stopped suddenly, replaced by that same slow scraping. It went on for several seconds, then silence again. I remember whispering to myself, "It's just the storm," but even I didn't believe it anymore. I decided to call my parents, but the phone line was dead. I didn't have a cell phone. The only other option was to wait it out until morning. But the thought of spending the whole night with that door just sitting there, possibly holding something inside, made my skin crawl. Then the noise came again. A single bang, but so hard the door visibly shuddered. That broke me. I grabbed my coat, shoved my feet into my boots without even tying them, and bolted out the front door. The cold air hit me, but I barely felt it. I ran straight to our neighbor's house, about 50 meters away. I banged on their door until Mr. Tremblay opened it, looking both concerned and confused. I must have looked terrified, because he didn't ask many questions. I blurted out that something was in our pantry, banging from the inside. He frowned and called the police before I could even finish explaining. 2 officers arrived within 15 minutes, lights flashing through the snow. They walked me back to my house while Mr. Tremblay followed. One officer stayed with me in the living room while the other checked the kitchen. I could hear him trying the pantry door, then calling to his partner that it was locked. They retrieved the key from above the stove, unlocked it, and opened the door. From where I sat, I couldn't see inside, but I heard one of them mutter, "Jesus," before the other told him to keep his voice down. They both stepped back and looked at each other in that way people do when they don't want to alarm someone. I got up and went to see. Inside, the pantry shelves were still intact, but the back wall and the inside of the door were covered in deep, jagged scratches. Not the kind you make with a knife. These were uneven, gouged into the wood in arcs and slashes, as if made by something with claws. Some scratches were so deep they had splintered the wood. There was nothing else inside. No animal, no debris. No way something could have entered without going through the locked door. The officers checked the rest of the house, then went outside to look for tracks in the snow. I stood at the kitchen table with Mr. Tremblay, who kept glancing at the pantry like he expected it to start moving again. When the officers came back, their expressions were even more unsettled. They hadn't found a single footprint, paw print, or any sign that anyone had been near the house. They asked me a few questions, wrote some things down, then told me I could stay at Mr. Tremblay's place until my parents came home. I didn't argue. Before we left, I saw one of the officers lock the pantry door again and keep the key in his pocket. I didn't ask for it back. That night at the Tremblays was the first night in my life I couldn't sleep at all. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined the sound of those bangs, that scraping. In my head, I kept replaying the way the wood had been torn up. The next day, my parents came home early after getting a call from the police. I expected them to comfort me, tell me it was just some raccoon that had gotten trapped somehow. But when they came back from looking at the pantry themselves, they didn't offer any explanations. My father just said we'd be keeping it locked from now on. For a while, life went back to normal, but I avoided the kitchen as much as I could. My parents kept the pantry locked at all times and eventually replaced the wooden door with a metal one. I overheard them arguing about whether to have the back wall replaced entirely, but they never did. The scratches stayed there, hidden behind the shelves, like some quiet secret we were all pretending to forget. I thought I'd managed to put it out of my mind until 3 years later, when we had to move some furniture around during a renovation. My father asked me to help him clear the pantry so the workers could fix some wiring in the wall. I didn't want to, but I wasn't about to admit I was still scared. We took everything out, cans, jars, boxes, until the shelves were bare. That's when I saw it. The scratches weren't just on the door and back wall anymore. They were along the sides, the floor, even the ceiling of the cupboard. More of them deeper. fresher. I ran my hand over one of the grooves and felt the rawness of splintered wood. My father saw it too, and for a moment, his face went pale. He told me to leave the room and didn't let me back in until the shelves were back in place. A week later, without telling me why, my parents had the entire pantry removed. The space was sealed off with drywall, painted over like it had never existed. They started storing food in a cabinet by the fridge. I didn't complain. I'm 35 now, and I live in a different city, far from that house. But sometimes when I'm alone and everything is quiet, I'll remember that first bang. I'll remember standing there, staring at a locked door, knowing, not guessing, not imagining, that something on the other side was trying to get out. And I'll wonder if sealing it away was really enough. Because a few months ago, out of curiosity, I looked up our old address online. The new owners had listed it for sale. The photos showed the kitchen completely renovated, except in the corner where the pantry used to be. The drywall was gone, replaced with a brand new cupboard. They'd built it back. And when I zoomed in on the listing photo, just enough to see the edge of the open door, I could swear I saw marks on the inside. Story number 7. I was 9 years old when the nightmares began. They came without warning, sharp and heavy like a door slamming shut in the middle of the night. At first, I didn't think much of them. Children have bad dreams, that's what my mom said. But these weren't like any dream I'd had before. They didn't feel made up. They felt remembered. Every night I would wake up shaking, my hair damp, my throat raw from screaming. I could never remember exactly how the dream began, only that I was suddenly standing in a narrow hallway lined with patterned carpet, red with a gold border. The walls were cream, but stained, as if something dark had soaked into them years ago. Somewhere ahead of me was a room, room 6. I always knew the number, though I never saw a sign. And beyond that room was the fire. It wasn't the kind of fire you imagine when someone says the word. No roaring flames filling the frame of your mind. No, this one was chaotic, hidden in moments. A flash of orange at the corner of my vision, the crack of timber snapping. The smell, God, the smell, sharp and oily, mixed with something sweeter, heavier, that I didn't understand then, but know now was the smell of burning flesh. In the dream, I wasn't alone. There was a woman in the hallway with me. I never saw her face. I only knew her by her voice, desperate, breaking. She kept calling for someone named Harry, her cries frantic, almost swallowed by the noise. The floor was hot under my bare feet, and every step made me wince. But I kept moving, because something deep inside me knew we didn't have long. I'd reach room 6's door, push it open, and then the heat would hit me all at once, like stepping into an oven. And then I'd wake up. At first, my parents tried to soothe me, telling me it was just my imagination. But after 2 weeks of waking in the early hours, screaming, they started to worry. My dad even checked the house for gas leaks, thinking maybe something was triggering my dreams, but nothing was wrong. And yet, night after night, I kept going back to that hallway. It was my mom who first noticed the strange detail, that I spoke about the layout of the hallway and the room like I'd been there. I'd describe how room 6 had a single brass bed pushed against the wall, the wallpaper peeling in the corner, the window jammed half open. I'd describe the heavy wardrobe in the corner, its mirror cracked in the top right. These weren't the sort of things a child would invent, and I'd say them as if they were facts, not guesses. One morning, after I'd spent most of the night crying and refusing to go back to sleep, Mom sat me down in the kitchen and asked me to tell her everything about the dream, from start to finish. I did, and when I finished, she just sat there staring at me. I thought she was angry for some reason, but later I realized she was scared. She didn't tell me right away, but that week she went to the library. This was 1980. SO research meant digging through old newspapers and archives, not typing into a search bar. A few days later she came home with a folded clipping, yellowed and brittle. She didn't show me at first, just spoke quietly to Dad in the other room. I sat in the hallway listening, the words fire, hotel, and Ballarat stuck in my mind. That night, she sat on the edge of my bed and told me that in 1926, there had been a fire at a hotel in Ballarat, the Royal Empire Hotel. 6 people had died. One of them was a woman named Margaret O'Donnell. She had been heard screaming for her son Harry, who was trapped in a different room. He didn't survive either. The fire had started in the kitchen and swept up the back staircase. Room 6 was directly above that staircase. I didn't know what to say. I remember feeling sick, like my insides had turned to water. It wasn't just that the story matched my dream, it was the way it matched. The layout, the room, the cries for Harry. My parents told me it was probably just coincidence. They said I must have overheard someone talking about it before, and my brain had twisted it into a dream. But I knew I'd never heard that story in my life, and I knew it wasn't coincidence. The nightmares got worse after that. It was no longer just the hallway and the heat. I began seeing flashes of the woman's hands as she tried to push the door open, her skin blistering and splitting. I began hearing the thud of something heavy falling in the room. The wardrobe, I think, blocking the door. And sometimes, in the dream, I wasn't just watching her. I was her. One night, I woke up on the floor beside my bed, my knees bruised, my throat raw from coughing. Mom rushed in, terrified. I told her I couldn't breathe, that the smoke was in my chest. She and Dad didn't know what to do anymore. They took me to a doctor, who said it was probably stress and maybe night terrors. He suggested keeping me calm before bed, no scary TV, a warm drink. It didn't help. If anything, the dreams became more real, more physical. I'd wake with the taste of soot in my mouth, my eyes burning as if I'd really been in smoke. It all came to a head one night. In late August, I was lying in bed, wide awake, afraid to close my eyes, when suddenly it was like I'd been pulled under. There was no drifting into sleep, just a snap, and I was in the hallway again. But this time something was different. I could hear a man's voice shouting from somewhere behind me. I turned and saw smoke thickening, swallowing the far end of the hall. The heat was suffocating. I tried to move forward, but my legs felt heavy, like I was walking through water. I reached room 6, but the door wouldn't budge. I could hear movement inside, a child crying. My own hands were blistering, the skin peeling as I pushed and pushed. And then, something I had never experienced before. The door burst open, and I was pulled inside by someone I couldn't see. The air was worse in there, choking. I stumbled forward, my foot catching on something soft, a body. The crying stopped, and then the entire room seemed to shudder. A sound like the earth splitting open filled my head, and everything went black. When I woke up, I was in my bed, but Mom was leaning over me, crying. She said she'd come in because she'd heard me shouting, "Harry, hurry," over and over. She said my hands had been pressed hard against the wall, as if I was trying to push something. When she took them away, the wallpaper where my palms had been was warm. That was the moment Dad decided we needed to see the place. I think he thought it would prove the whole thing was just in my head, that if I saw the hotel, I'd realize it was nothing like in my dreams. But the Royal Empire Hotel wasn't there anymore. It had been rebuilt in the 30s after the fire, and most of the original structure was gone. Still, the owner was an older man who knew about the fire. When Mom explained why we were there, he looked at me in a way that made my skin prickle. He said part of the original building still stood, the north wing. He led us through a side door into a dim corridor. The carpet was different, the wallpaper newer, but the bones of the place were the same. I knew it instantly. My feet moved before my brain caught up. I walked straight to where room 6 had been. The door there now had a different number, but I knew it. Without asking, I stepped inside. The layout was exactly as I'd seen it. Bed to the left, window to the right, wardrobe in the far corner. The wardrobe now was modern, no mirror, but I could still see where the old one had stood. There was a faint, jagged mark on the wall, as if something heavy had smashed into it long ago. I walked over to the window and tried to open it. It stuck halfway, just like in my dreams. When I turned around, Mom was pale, Dad silent. The owner was watching me with his lips pressed tight. He said quietly that this room had been rebuilt on the exact footprint of the old room 6. He didn't tell guests that, not anymore. People had said it was unlucky. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I kept thinking about the child in the room, about the woman's voice calling for Harry. I felt this weight in my chest, like I had unfinished business. I couldn't explain why, but I felt that if I didn't go back, really go back, the dreams would never stop. 2 nights later, I had the dream again. But this time, I didn't run for the door. I turned and went for the window. It was stuck, just like before, but I forced it open enough to squeeze through. I could hear the fire behind me, the woman's voice screaming my name, not Harry, my name. I looked back, and for the first time, I saw her face. It wasn't a stranger's, it was my own. I woke up gasping, my whole body shaking. I didn't tell my parents that part. How could I? It didn't make sense. But deep down, I understood. Those dreams weren't just memories, they were mine. I don't know how, but in another life, in another time, I had been that woman. I had died, in that fire, in that room. And now, for some reason, I remembered. The nightmares stopped after that night, completely. I thought that would be the end of it. But a few months later, I overheard Mom on the phone to my aunt. She didn't know I was listening. She was telling her about the fire, about my dreams, and then she said something that froze me in place. She said my great-grandmother's sister had died in that fire, a woman named Margaret O'Donnell. I never asked Mom about it. I didn't need to. I knew, and knowing was enough. Because sometimes, the past doesn't stay buried. Sometimes, it finds its way back to you, through dreams, through memories, through fire. And when it does, there's no escaping it, only remembering. And I remember everything. Story number 8. I was standing in the ticket hall of Rockwagwani, leaning against one of the worn marble pillars, killing time before my train to Krakow. It was April 1985, and I had been in the city on business. The station was its usual mix of voices, hurried footsteps, and the faint metallic hum of the loudspeaker. Then I noticed a man collapse just a few meters away from me. He went down hard, hitting the tiled floor without so much as a shout. People gasped, a few called for help, and I was already moving toward him when I knelt beside him. His eyes were wide open but unfocused, like he was staring at something far away. He was pale, mid-40s perhaps, wearing a plain brown coat and trousers that looked a little old-fashioned. Though I didn't think much of it at first, a station worker rushed over, and between us we got him onto his side. Someone else ran to get the station's first aid staff. The man's breathing was shallow, and he didn't respond to questions. Then, without warning, he blinked, sat up abruptly, and grabbed my arm so hard it hurt. "I must catch the Berlin Express," he said, his voice desperate. "It leaves at 16:22. Before the war starts." I thought he was delirious. "You're in Rockwah," I told him, speaking slowly. "It's 1985. The Berlin Express." I stopped because he was staring at me like I'd just told him. The sun had gone out. "No," he said, shaking his head. "It's August 25th, 1939. I'm late. They're waiting for me. I can't miss it." A few people nearby laughed nervously, assuming he was confused or mad. But there was something in his eyes, not the vague disorientation of someone who'd fainted, but a fierce, urgent clarity. The first aid attendant arrived, a short, brisk woman with a medical kit, and began checking his pulse. He resisted her touch, pulling away. "Listen to me," he said, still gripping my sleeve. "Car 7. There's a man with a red scarf, a German officer in civilian clothes, a young mother with 2 boys. They don't know it yet, but in a week, Berlin will be gone. I have to warn them." I tried to calm him, telling him none of this made sense. But then he began rattling off details, the name of the conductor, the exact time the train would pull out, even the fact that the whistle would blow twice due to a brake test before departure. He spoke as if reciting a memory, not an idea. Something about the precision of it, the certainty, made my stomach knot. The attendant and a railway guard insisted he be taken to the station's medical room. As they led him away, he looked over his shoulder at me. "You believe me?" he said. It wasn't a question, and the unnerving thing was, I realized I did. At least a little. I don't know why. I followed them, but I did. The medical room was a cramped office with a cot and a desk. They tried to get him to lie down, but he refused. He kept glancing at the clock, muttering that there was still time if they'd just let him go. I asked him his name, but he hesitated before answering. "It doesn't matter," he said. "What matters is the train. You don't understand. History is set. But sometimes it bends. I've done this before." The attendant gave me a look that clearly meant, "He's mad," but she stepped out to get paperwork, leaving me alone with him for a moment. That's when he spoke quickly, in a low voice. "I've been here before, in this station. The first time I missed it. The second time. They wouldn't let me on. Now, maybe you can help me. If you get me to platform 3, I can board before it's too late." "You're talking about 46 years ago," I said. "The platform wouldn't even have the same number. It's the same." He interrupted. "Time folds here. You'll see." The guard returned to say a doctor had been called. The man's eyes darted to the wall clock. It was 16:05. He suddenly lunged for the door, knocking the guard aside with surprising strength, and bolted into the corridor. I swear he moved faster than I would have thought possible. I followed. Without thinking, the guard shouting behind me, he ran toward the platforms, weaving through startled passengers. I nearly lost him twice, but then I saw him descend the old stairwell that led to the older section of the station, a part that, as far as I knew, had been closed for years. The gate was open. I don't know why. I followed him down. The air changed immediately. The sound of the station above faded, replaced by the faint hiss of steam. At the bottom of the stairs, the tiled walls looked cleaner, newer. I turned the corner and froze. The platform was crowded, but not with anyone. Dressed for 1985. Men in fedoras and women in summer dresses, children clutching worn suitcases. A porter in a dark uniform wheeled a trolley stacked with wooden crates. And on the far track, a black locomotive idled, venting thick steam. He was there, already halfway to the train. I shouted, but my voice felt swallowed by the space. He turned, once to look at me. His face was lighter somehow, like he'd stepped into sunlight. Then he boarded. I stumbled forward, not knowing what else to do. I passed people whose conversations were in Polish and German, their accents strange, old-fashioned. No one seemed to notice me. I reached the edge of the platform just as the whistle blew once. Then again, exactly as he'd said, the train began to move. I ran alongside it, but my legs felt heavy, as if the air was thicker. I caught sight of him at a window. He raised his hand in a brief wave. Then the carriage slid past, and he was gone. And then, just as suddenly, the platform was empty, silent. The tracks were bare. I stood there, breathing hard, my mind refusing to understand. I turned back toward the stairwell and found myself looking at a locked gate with a rusted chain, exactly as I remembered it being years ago when I first passed by it. No sound of steam, no people, just the faint echo of voices from the main station above. When I made my way back up, the guard and the attendant were waiting near the corridor, looking irritated and confused. They asked if I'd seen where he went. I told them I lost him in the crowd. They exchanged glances, clearly thinking I was lying or mistaken. The guard muttered something about people disappearing all the time and walked off. But I knew what I'd seen and what I hadn't imagined. I couldn't stop thinking about it. That night in my hotel room, I tried to convince myself it had been some elaborate prank, maybe a film shoot I'd stumbled into. But the details didn't fit. I even checked old records the next day at the public library. There had indeed been a Berlin Express that left Rockwall on August 25, 1939, at precisely 16:22. It arrived in Berlin later that evening, just days before the invasion of Poland. And here's the thing. The passenger list I found in a dusty archive included a man whose name I recognized from a wartime photo in one of the books. The face was older in the photo, but it was him, the same man I'd seen faint in the station. I tried to let it go, but over the next few weeks, odd things started happening. In the quiet moments, shaving in the morning, walking home at night, I would hear faintly the sound of a steam whistle, distant but clear. Once, crossing a street, I thought I saw him standing on the opposite corner, wearing the same coat, watching me. But when I blinked, the spot was empty. 2 months later, I was back in Rockwall for another trip. I told myself I wouldn't go near the station except to catch my train home. But on the day of my departure, I arrived early, too early, and found myself wandering toward that old stairwell. The gate was locked, just as before. I stood there longer than I should have, almost expecting it to open. When I finally turned to leave, I heard a voice behind me. "You could still help me." I spun around. He was there, hands in his coat, pockets, looking exactly as he had that first day, no older, no younger. The same intensity in his eyes. I wanted to speak, but my throat was dry. It didn't work. He said, "They didn't listen. I need another chance." "This isn't possible," I said, more to myself than to him. "Possible." He repeated, almost smiling, "It's already happened. That's why you remember me." I told him I didn't want any part of whatever this was. He stepped closer, and I could smell the faint scent of coal smoke on his clothes. "You've seen it," he said softly. "You've felt it. You know the time between times. It's not done with you." Before I could respond, he turned and walked toward the locked gate. I opened my mouth to call after him, but he was simply gone. Not behind the gate, not anywhere. I left the station as quickly as I could, but the sound of the whistle followed me again that night, and the next. It's been years now, and I still hear it sometimes, a low, mournful note from somewhere I can't place. I've never told anyone else about it until now, because lately I've been dreaming of the platform, not the one in 1985, but the one in 1939. I'm there, standing beside the train, a ticket in my hand. The conductor nods at me as if I belong. The passengers glance my way without surprise. The whistle blows once, then twice, and every time. Just before I step onto the carriage, I wake up. But last night, I didn't wake up. The dream went on. I stepped inside. The door closed behind me, and I'm not sure, not really sure at all, that when I wake up next, it will be here.